Good afternoon, everyone. And the first item of business today is portfolio questions. And in order to get as many people in as possible, I'd be grateful if we could have short questions and succinct answers, please. Portfolio questions today are on finance, employment and sustainable growth. Question 1, Rhoda Grant.
To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to provide permanent employment opportunities for people who will be on temporary contracts during the Christmas period.
Thank you. Minister Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is helping businesses create jobs all year round through capital investment in infrastructure development, through public procurement and business and export support services, as well as training and skills programmes. Scotland also offers the most competitive business tax regime in the UK, freeing resources to enable businesses to create permanent jobs.
Many thanks. Rhoda Grant.
People employed on short-term contracts over Christmas tend to be low-paid and have unsociable hours. Will the Government, when it's giving grant funding to businesses, make it a condition of that funding that employees or staff employed by subcontractors should be paid the living wage, not be placed on zero-hour contracts, and should have reasonable employment conditions?
Minister.
Well, I think, as we have made clear, Presiding Officer, on several occasions in the past, that the economic development agencies in Scotland who deal with grant funding such as RSA support already take account of these matters, and particularly zero hours contracts are not consistent with successful grant funding from the RSA. So I think that has already been taken into account. I mean, what I would say is that in relation to employment at the festive period, Presiding Officer, I think it is reasonable to expect that some companies do need to, firstly, ask staff to work for longer hours to reflect a greater volume of work that requires to be done, and that in some cases they require to take on temporary staff. In other words, that is part of the market, and we recognise that. But at the same time, we must ensure, as far as within our powers in this Parliament, that all employees are properly and fairly remunerated for said work.
Thank you. Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the context of good employment practice, can the Minister confirm what further steps the Scottish Government is taking to address the unacceptable and illegal practice of blacklisting?
Minister.
Well, plainly, we, and I think really all parties across this chamber, view blacklisting as a totally unacceptable practice, and one which, fortunately, has received a great deal of attention recently. As Mr Eadie knows, employment law is at present, under the current constitutional arrangements, reserved to the UK Government. I am absolutely confident that any government of an independent Scotland, Presiding Officer, will deal with blacklisting in a way which is as effective as Mr Eadie and the vast majority of people in this chamber would wish to do.
Thank you. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. I wonder if the Minister has seen the recent research that says that workers employed on zero-hours contracts are the happiest with their work-life balance of any workers. Does the Minister think that zero-hours contracts are bad in every case?
Minister.
Well, the answer to Mr Fraser's question is no. I haven't seen that research. When I read it, I think I will apply some considerable degree of sceptical forensic analysis thereto. It does seem a very dubious prospect that people on zero-hours contracts, who will tend, by the very nature, to be in low pay, should somehow be the happiest people on the planet. That does seem to be a somewhat dubious proposition, even if I may say so, Presiding Officer, for a Conservative.
Finlay.
On the issue of blacklisting, will the Minister ensure that an anti-blacklisting clause is on the face of the bill and not only in guidance being given out with the bill?
Minister.
Well, I'm a lawyer, but I think it's important that we shouldn't be legalistic in this Parliament. The objective that Mr Finlay wishes to achieve is the objective that all of us share as our broad approach and objective. I mean, whether a matter is faced on the place well, I'm giving you the answer, Mr Finlay. If you want to hear it, you can listen to it. Whether that is dealt with by primary or subordinate legislation or guidance is a matter of judgment in each case, and in this case for the Minister handling the legislation. But rest assured, we are determined to tackle this issue, and we will take all appropriate steps in order to do so.
Many thanks. Question 2, Dr Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the claim by the Institute for Fiscal Studies that an independent Scotland would face a fiscal gap of 1.9% of national income.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the Institute for Fiscal Studies analysis confirms that Scotland is in a stronger fiscal position than the UK. The IFS analysis also shows that Scotland is no different from any other developed country in facing long-term fiscal challenges. The UK as a whole is projected to be in deficit for every one of the next 50 years. However, the IFS projections assume that we continue to be locked into a future of low growth, population decline and failed economic policies of the UK Government. Under independence, we will have control of the economic levers required to increase productivity, increase our exports and put our public finances on a long-term sustainable footing.
Dr Murray.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his reply. Assuming, just for the purposes of this question, that policies such as reducing corporation tax would grow the economy in an independent Scotland, growth would not happen overnight. So how would the Cabinet Secretary propose that this gap is met in the short term? By increased taxation, by increased borrowing or by reduced public spending?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the refreshing part, well, there are two refreshing parts about Dr Murray's question. The first is that she's now engaging in the discussion about the possibilities that arise once we have the powers of independence in this Parliament, and I very much welcome her to that side of the argument, and there will be a warm welcome for her in relation to that argument. And the second point is that Dr Murray is actually now considering, and it's not a surprise to me that she's considering it because of the position that she adopts on many of these issues, the arguments around the possibilities of delivering economic growth, and has moved away from the sterile argument which I think predominates from the coalition in the UK and which has also been replicated by her own leadership in this Parliament, that the only opportunity to strengthen the public finances is either to increase taxation or to reduce public expenditure. There is the opportunity to deliver economic growth. That is what this government believes in, and that's why we think the powers of independence will enable Scotland to grow the economy and to repair the public finances that have been left in such a weakened position by the failures of United Kingdom governments.
Gavin Brown.
Presiding Officer, has the Scottish Government carried out financial projections for an independent Scotland post-2016-17?
The Scottish Government has taken forward the projections to 2016-17 that are published in the White Paper, published openly in the White Paper, and what they establish is that the platform for the establishment of an independent Scotland puts Scotland into a stronger financial position than the rest of the United Kingdom. And then, of course, the opportunities are up to members of the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government and the whole of the community of Scotland to create the strongest economic opportunities we can as a consequence of the decisions we take with the full economic levers of independence.
Joan McAlpine.
Presiding Officer, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how Scotland will be placed relative to other countries in terms of its wealth after independence, and how this will compare to the rest of the UK?
Cabinet Secretary.
If we take the analysis which would be driven by analysis of wealth per capita, Scotland would be ranked the 8th richest nation in the OECD grouping, which I think indicates some of the financial and economic strength of an independent Scotland, and it's on those foundations that an independent Scotland would be able to take its own decisions about the way in which we strengthen economic performance and create a country of greater economic opportunities than the rest of the United Kingdom.
Ian Gray, finally.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. With regard to the Cabinet Secretary's first answer to Elaine Murray, the 1.9% figure in her question refers to the IFS's most optimistic scenario, which actually assumes 2.2% productivity growth, 3 times the expected net migration, and uses Mr Swinney's own best case oil revenue predictions. Yet they still find that we would face a choice between tax rises or cuts in public expenditure. So which would it be?
Cabinet Secretary.
In a sense, I rest my case based on my answer to Dr Murray that the Labour front bench seems to be obsessed by the choices between increasing taxation or reducing public expenditure. What this government wants to do is to use the economic levers of independence to strengthen the foundations of our country and to ensure we create the opportunities that people in Scotland have a right to expect. And I would have thought that was the type of economic agenda, that dynamic economic agenda that might have appealed to people of Mr Gray's political outlook, but it seems that the coalition that he's now established with his allies in the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party in the Better Together campaign is now influencing all Labour thinking that all they can think about is tax rises or cuts in public expenditure. It's time for Mr Gray to look more broadly at this debate and have some imagination about what's possible in this country.
Many thanks. Question 3, Claudia Beamish.
To ask the Scottish Government what account the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth takes of sustainable development in his policy framework for sustainable growth.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
President Officer, sustainability is a central feature of our framework for economic growth and has been since the Government came to power in 2007. As the Government economic strategy sets out, sustainable economic growth centres on building a dynamic and growing economy that will provide prosperity and opportunities for all, while ensuring that future generations can enjoy a better quality of life too. This drives policy priorities, including our annual budget process, with progress monitored through Scotland Performs and our National Performance Framework.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer and referring to the Scotland Performs and National Performance Framework. But in view of the aims of that framework for a flourishing and prosperous Scotland for all, can the Cabinet Secretary explain why he prefers the use in the Scottish Government finance policy of the term sustainable economic growth, when the term sustainable development, encompassing social, economic and environmental strands, and in the view of many, being a clearer definition with more robust legal status, better encapsulates our future direction and, indeed, the dynamic agenda which Scottish Labour is working towards?
I think, in a sense, my answer to Claudia Beamish relates to the framework that we've established as part of Scotland Performs. Because what that is, and we've helpfully had a number of opportunities to discuss this question in the group that I've established to look at the review of the National Performance Framework, in which Claudia Beamish is a welcome participant. We essentially have what would be described as a balanced scorecard, where we bring together a range of different indicators which will reflect considerations of social, economic and environmental impact as a consequence of the policy interventions that we take forward. So the Scotland Performs framework is designed to give exactly the type of balance in our policy choices that Claudia Beamish has raised in her question. It's an approach to which I am entirely committed, because I think what it gives is an opportunity for us to consider within our policy choices the implications of different measures, different steps, and how they can contribute towards improving the outcomes for people in Scotland.
Thanks. Question 4, Nanette Milne.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what assessments it has made of the impact of public service reforms on the North East.
Mr Derek Mackay.
Public service reform is delivering improvements and outcomes for people across Scotland. In the North East, community plan partnerships are bringing partners and communities together to deliver better outcomes. The single outcome agreements provide a clear plan for place and a focus on prevention. For example, the Aberdeenshire Single Outcome Agreement has identified £3 million being invested in the development of extended early years provision to provide early intervention in the lives of children and families who require additional support. Another example from Dundee is the City Council and NHS Tayside establishing an early intervention team to offer preventative support for families on the edge of crisis. This is groundbreaking in the sense that it brings Barnardo's, Children First, Aberlour and Action for Children together to deliver a joint service.
Nanette Milne.
I thank the Minister for his response, which doesn't quite answer what I'm about to ask him. There has been growing concern that under the centralisation of services like the police, forensics and fire and rescue service, Aberdeen in the North East is seeing the loss of a number of key public sector jobs. The Minister will be aware that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service is currently undertaking a review with plans to close 5 of the existing 8 control rooms in Scotland, and concerns have been expressed to me that because of the buoyant North East economy, the decision on the control room in Aberdeen may be influenced by the low unemployment rate in that city. Can I have the Minister's assurance that decision-making around such public service reforms are independent of such factors, and does he believe that Aberdeen and the North East should be given a fair share of public sector jobs?
Minister.
I'm glad that Nanette Milne has refined the question somewhat from the opening question. Now, what I was focusing on was the government's preventative agenda, which is something we achieve in partnership. So we'll turn to outcomes that matter in the North East there too. We have policing plans, we have fire plans, we have single outcome agreements that focus on outcomes that matter, moving away from inputs, necessarily number of staff or number of stations and control rooms, so on. What matters is outcomes, the effectiveness, the efficiency of services around the 4 pillars of public sector reform: prevention, integration, workforce development and improved performance with existing resources. And it's on that point that I would answer the specific question, that we as a government and with our agencies and partners continue to work in partnership to focus on outcomes and making best use of resources. And in that sense, I think we would welcome reduced crime. We would welcome efficient responses to local issues, more prevention around, say, fire safety and community safety as well. And that's a very proactive agenda, and I'm sure that the member will be reassured with the consultation that has been delivered in terms of the restructuring of some individual services, which will leave a very strong footprint across Scotland, and particularly in the North East of Scotland.
Many thanks. Brief questions and answers would be appreciated, please. Question 5, John Pentland.
To ask the Scottish Government what recent action it has taken to encourage economic development in Motherwell and Wishaw.
Minister Fergus Ewing.
The Scottish Government is committed to supporting and encouraging sustainable economic growth in North Lanarkshire, including Motherwell and Wishaw, and we're using all available levers to deliver that growth. Last Friday, we announced 22 successful projects being funded by the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund, including the Cumbernauld Community Enterprise Centre and the Forgewood Community Centre in North Motherwell, which will receive £5 million to develop new multifunctional community spaces, kick-starting renewed physical regeneration, which will benefit some of North Lanarkshire's most deprived communities.
Thanks. John Pentland.
Can I thank the Minister for that response? Over 20 years on, Europe's largest brownfield site at Ravenscraig is making welcome but slow progress. We have seen development of a college, a sports facility and some housing, but there remains huge untapped potential. What measures are being put in place to support the proposed national priority status for Ravenscraig, to accelerate development and encourage potential investors when NPF3 is brought forward?
Minister.
I think that's a very fair question, and I think we share the same objectives as Mr Pentland in this respect. And let me answer his question. As a commitment to the area, working with North Lanarkshire Council, the Ravenscraig Phase 2 of the tax incremental financing project, provisionally approved by ministers in March 2011, is one of 4 pilots approved by the Scottish Government. This includes £73 million of public infrastructure investment, which should lever in £425 million of private investment and create over 4,000 full-time equivalent jobs. Secondly, the regeneration of Ravenscraig continues, Presiding Officer, apace. Recently, £2 million was invested in working up the technical design and costings of area planning briefs for Phase 2 development, with 93,000 square metres of retail and leisure facilities and 10,500 square metres of commercial space. In addition, there has been a great deal of activity, and I will write to the member, by Scottish Enterprise in support of small businesses and larger businesses, and a great deal of effort by the Business Gateway as well. So I think we are agreed that we must do everything we can to help the regeneration of Ravenscraig and the surrounding area, and I believe that we're making good progress towards that objective.
Excellent. Question 6, Annabel Goldie.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the demographic projections in the recent Institute of Fiscal Studies report on the fiscal sustainability of an independent Scotland.
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, developed countries across the world face demographic issues, and Scotland is no different in that respect. However, at present we lack the policy levers to respond to this challenge. With independence, we will be able to grow our working age population by ensuring that young Scots have the opportunity to build a career in this country, and by making it easier for the highly skilled students who come to study at our universities to work in our country. The Institute for Fiscal Studies projections show the costs of remaining part of the United Kingdom. This simply underlines the urgent need for Scotland to achieve independence and have access to the full range of economic policy levers to boost economic growth.
Honourable Goldie.
The Scottish Government was, of course, quick to criticise the IFS report, but one point seems to have hit home. In yesterday's White Paper, the Scottish Government appeared to accept Scotland has a relatively more challenging situation with pensions than the UK as a whole. And this turnaround has also seen a movement in policy, switching from talk of a reduction in the pension age to potentially delaying the age threshold rise to 67, and now leaving it all to a commission to report in 2018. Isn't it glaringly obvious that when it comes to pensions in an independent Scotland, the Scottish Government doesn't know what it is doing, when it will do it and what it will cost?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that was a thoughtful contribution to the debate on the future of the country. I think Ms Goldie, in marshalling that information, has inadvertently missed out in her research process the paper that was published by the Scottish Government over the summer on pensions in an independent Scotland, because a vast amount of the detail that Ms Goldie has talked about and speculated about was contained within the policy paper on pensions published over the summer. It has therefore informed the White Paper, so I'm not in any way certain how Ms Goldie has come to the conclusions that she has come to. What I would say to her is that, of course, pensions in Scotland, in an independent Scotland, are more affordable than they are in the rest of the United Kingdom, given the fact that we allocate a lower proportion of our public expenditure towards social protection as a share of GDP than is done in the United Kingdom. All of that information is marshalled in the White Paper, and I would encourage Ms Goldie to look at it once again to inform her of the opportunities and the benefits of independence in safeguarding pensions for people in an independent Scotland.
Kenneth Gibson.
Is the Cabinet Secretary aware that not only is IFS, as it admits, incapable of predicting accurately 50 years into the future, the report was out of date even on the day it was published? It excluded, for example, the impact of the £4 billion investment in the Kraken field and the 20,000 skilled jobs it will create by 2017.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that is a fair observation of what of the timing of the report. But I think, to be absolutely fair to the IFS, and Ms Goldie said that the Scottish Government had attacked the IFS. I think I'd encourage Ms Goldie to go back and look at the press cuts about this, because she will at no stage find me attacking the IFS. What I indicated was that if the IFS make a projection that the UK is going to be in deficit in its public finances for 50 years, and they apply the same considerations to Scotland as part of the United Kingdom, then it's hardly surprising they come up with the analysis that they come up with. But what the IFS do say, and this is material to Mr Gibson's question, the IFS report says that many of the variables used in the projections are, and I quote, inherently uncertain and could evolve differently if Scotland were independent rather than part of the United Kingdom. And in addition, they could be substantially affected by the policies chosen by the government of an independent Scotland. And that is my point, that an independent Scotland will have a range of options to take forward to determine what is the right set of economic measures to be taken on behalf of the people of Scotland, and that opportunity will only open up if we vote yes in the referendum. So the IFS report sets out a position which is essentially a subset of the failed direction of travel of the United Kingdom, and what independence offers for Scotland is the chance to chart a new and a more prosperous course.
Many thanks. Question 7, Ken McIntosh.
To ask the Scottish Government what additional support it can give to expand the provision of credit unions across the country.
Minister Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, we are encouraging credit unions to access our current third sector business support and development programmes, including Just Enterprise and the Enterprise Ready Fund.
Ken McIntosh.
Can I thank the Minister for his answer, and can I also thank his colleague Mr Swinney for the support he has given ethical finance more generally. Can I ask the Minister if he is aware, not least from the attendance of Mr Swinney's officials at a recent meeting, a recent round table on ethical finance, of the difficulties many Scots still have in accessing a local credit union. Some Scots still have no credit union in their own locality. Can I ask the Minister if he will look at ways to expand credit union provision, perhaps through supporting rate relief, such as offered by Glasgow City Council, or through establishing a loan guarantee fund?
Minister.
Yes, I think both Mr McIntosh and myself and our respective parties share the objective that throughout Scotland, citizens should, irrespective of where they live, have access to a local credit union. And I think he's also right to imply that the position is patchy at the moment. In some parts of Scotland, for example Glasgow, there are very strong and active credit unions. In other parts of Scotland, access is not of quite the same degree because although there are over 100 credit unions in Scotland, they are of various size and capacity. So I think it's a perfectly fair question. We are completely determined to make sure that more and more people should be able to access credit unions and proceed to exercise their finances on the basis of the principle of thrift, rather than resort to payday loans, which are the source of such social misery in this country. And again, where I think members such as Kes Dugdale and John Wilson have been extremely active in campaigning for shared objectives. The tragedy is, at the moment, we do not have the regulatory powers to introduce a cap on payday loans right now, but I am pleased that the UK Government has been persuaded, apparently, towards this objective.
Thank you. Question 8, Colin Keir.
To ask the Scottish Government what evidence there is that the Community Council's Short Life Working Group recommendation that there is continued drive aimed at the community and community councils for contested community council elections has been achieved in recent community council elections.
Minister Derek Mackay.
In response to the recommendations and in collaboration with COSLA, I have asked the Improvement Service to undertake a project to help enhance the role of community councils, and this includes a proposal to run pilot projects to increase the number of contested elections.
Colin Keir.
Thank the Minister for his answer. Could I ask him if he intends to take any further steps than that to encourage participation in community councils and, in doing so, increase the number of contested elections to community council elections in the future?
Minister.
We will certainly consider the findings of this work, continue to work in partnership with local authorities and supporting community councils, and work on the government's empowerment agenda, not least including the Community Empowerment Scotland Bill, to try and give community councils an enhanced role, and hopefully that will increase participation in those bodies.
Thanks. Question 9, Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what representations it has received regarding a waiting allowance for public sector workers in the Aberdeen Travel to Work area.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I am aware of the concerns of public and private sector workers in the Aberdeen area. The Government has a range of policies to support those who are finding times difficult financially. Our pay policy focuses resources on the lower paid by promoting the Scottish living wage alongside distinctive measures to address low pay. The pay policy also provides employers with flexibility to address local issues through pay where necessary. This Government's policy of no compulsory redundancy provides support and reassurance to public sector workers, and we are also delivering on our commitment to the social wage.
What?
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Given the immense pressure on recruitment and retention of public sector employees, such as teachers and nurses in the Aberdeen Travel to Work area, does the Cabinet Secretary think that there should be an allowance similar to the London waiting allowance for public sector workers in the Aberdeen area?
I recognise the circumstances of public sector workers living and working in the Aberdeen area, and in my original answer I have outlined a number of measures the Government is taking to address this issue. Although we have no current plans to introduce an Aberdeen waiting allowance along the lines of that suggested by Maureen Watt, some flexibilities already exist within our pay policy and in the pay arrangements for other public sector staff to address recruitment and labour market issues, whether this be by grade or by locality. We will, of course, continue to monitor the situation.
Many thanks. Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary recognised that in the National Health Service in particular, the changes that were made some 9 years ago to replace London waiting with high-cost supplements allow that to be applied to other parts of the United Kingdom, and it's therefore open to the Scottish Government using that model to recognise the exceptional costs that apply to NHS staff in and around Aberdeen, and to look at funding and introducing such a system for NHS staff in NHS Grampian.
Cabinet Secretary.
The point I would make to Mr MacDonald is that within our existing pay policy there are flexibilities that employers are able to exercise to consider any particular issues that are a challenge about recruitment or retention of staff in individual spheres of employment, and that certainly is an opportunity that is available to NHS Grampian or to other public sector bodies to consider those flexibilities that are already inherent within our pay policy.
Thank you. Question 10, Duncan McNeill.
To ask the Scottish Government when the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth last met the Chief Executive of the Scottish Enterprise and what was discussed.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I last met the Chief Executive and other members of the Board of Scottish Enterprise on the 11th of November to discuss a range of issues important to the delivery of the Scottish Government's economic strategy.
Duncan McNeill.
The Cabinet Secretary's reply. In August last year, Cabinet Secretary, you kindly agreed to come to Inverclyde and hear of the opportunities of the development in our area. At the time, you said the Scottish Government would promote Inverclyde as an area for investment. You also acknowledged that we look to be in a strong position to participate in the renewables industry. And indeed, in January this year, you also acknowledged the significant opportunities to expand cruise liner activity at Inverclyde. Can the Cabinet Secretary give an indication of what action has been taken by the Scottish Government and Scottish Enterprise to promote Inverclyde as an area for investment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Mr McNeill highlighted a number of different examples where it's quite specifically in relation to the issue of cruise liner developments. Scottish Enterprise have been working with local partners in Inverclyde to develop the cruise liner proposition at James Watt Dock, and there are other examples through the dialogue that we're having with a variety of different inward investment organisations where Inverclyde is clearly marketed as one of the opportunities and sites for potential development. I'm very happy to provide Mr McNeill with some further detail on the interaction and dialogue that we've taken forward in that respect, and we'll update him about that following this session this afternoon.
Thank you. Question 11 in the name of Chick Brodie has not been lodged, although an explanation has been provided. Question 12, Nigel Dawn.
To ask the Scottish Government what the impact on the economy is of university graduates seeking employment outside Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the vast majority of Scottish domiciled leavers from Scottish higher education institutions who go into work remain and work in Scotland, contributing to our economy and providing us with value for our investment. We support global mobility and encourage students and graduates to widen their horizons. The Scottish economy benefits from graduates with a cultural awareness and international perspective, the confidence to work across boundaries and language skills. We welcome students and graduates from further afield who also contribute to the Scottish economy, and clearly we've set out arguments and proposals why we should welcome more of these individuals to contribute to the Scottish economy.
Nigel Dawn.
Cabinet Secretary, for that response. I had a very recent presentation from Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, which is clearly hooked up with the oil and gas industry, based around it very naturally, and is obviously doing an excellent job there. I wonder whether the Cabinet Secretary could tell me whether there are other opportunities for individual universities or perhaps departments to hook up with other industries or perhaps individual firms to make sure that it's easier for graduates to move into employment in Scotland. Cabinet Secretary.
One of the important parts of this dialogue is ensuring that our university community or the higher education institution community is very closely aligned with the needs and the aspirations of the business sector within Scotland and the Scottish economy. I'm increasingly confident that we are now seeing the fruits of that work demonstrated by the way in which institutions are working very closely with the business community. The work of industry leadership groups and the Joint Skills Committee of the Funding Council and Skills Development Scotland is an important forum in determining how we should shape the priorities and the approaches of our higher education institutions in creating the necessary educational opportunities that can be linked up with the business community into the bargain. And that work will continue to ensure that we improve the connections that exist between educational institutions and the business community in Scotland.
Thank you. Question 13, Jim Hume.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what criteria Visit Scotland uses to determine whether a town is a suitable location for a visitor information centre.
Minister Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, the provision of Visit Scotland information centres is an operational matter for Visit Scotland. It categorises sites for visitor information centres according to a range of factors, including footfall, bookings, the footprint of international visitors, proximity to high tourist traffic routes and proximity to significant clusters of attractions and activities.
Thank you.
I thank the Minister for that response. Earlier this year, Visit Scotland's Director for South Scotland described the Borders Railway as a game changer and an amazing opportunity. I absolutely agree, but despite the presence of 3 visitor information centres, 2 seasonal information centres and 2 information points throughout the borders, none of these are located in Galashiels. Does the Minister therefore agree with me that given Galashiels will be the main destination for rail services very soon, leaving Edinburgh, that the lack of an information centre would be an anomaly? And will he assure me that Galashiels will be served with a visitor information centre to advise tourists on the many, many wonderful attractions available when they arrive in this beautiful corner of the borders?
Well done. Minister.
Well, we agree the borders are a magnificent place to have a holiday, Presiding Officer. That's why we have promoted golfing the borders to over 2 million consumers and invested £650,000 in capital works to Abbotsford, the home of Sir Walter Scott. Jim Hume is quite right to point to the fact that the Scottish Government's policy of reopening the Borders Railway will lead to many great opportunities. Many advantages will follow from the policies that we implement as the Scottish Government, and therefore I am perfectly happy to engage with them in due course as to the manifold opportunities, such as considering the one that he has posited today.
Many thanks. Question 14, Kezia Dugdale.
To ask the Scottish Government how it considers the use of so-called zero-hour contracts contributes to its strategy for sustainable economic growth.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, on the 7th of November, the Deputy First Minister made clear that the inappropriate use of zero-hours contracts is unacceptable. The Scottish Government's economic strategy is focused on ensuring that we create valuable and well-remunerated positions of employment within our economic growth strategy that will enable individuals to have fulfilling careers and to realise their economic potential within Scotland.
Kezia Dugdale.
The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that there are 27,000 people across Scotland on zero-hour contracts, 8,000 of which are in the higher education sector. In the Finance Minister's answer to Alison Johnson on the 11th of September, he said he urged employers in all sectors who employ staff on zero-hour contracts to consider their use of such contracts. Could the Cabinet Secretary detail those urges? What is he actually doing to deter the use of those contracts?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there's a very good example of this just the other day, which was reported to the First Minister and I at the biannual meeting of the Government and the Scottish Trade Union Congress, where the UCU, the University and Colleges Union, reported that as a consequence of my intervention with the University of Edinburgh is now actively exploring with the UCU the utilisation of zero-hours contracts, and that initiative and intervention that I made was very positively embraced by the UCU.
Many thanks. Patrick Harvey, question 16.
Thank you. Can I ask the Scottish Government what role it sees for local banking in the future of the financial services sector?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government's banking strategy published earlier this year made clear that a responsible, sustainable banking sector, responsive to the needs of its customers, is a crucial part of the economy, as well as Scottish society and the economy. Work is also underway to identify options for developing community banking further in Scotland.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary and I both hope that he will soon have the privilege of negotiating for Scotland's ownership of a share of the publicly owned financial services companies currently owned by UKFI. Does he agree with me that transforming large centralised banks into a network of small locally owned and locally governed banks would have a far bigger benefit in removing the barriers for small businesses to access finance from publicly owned institutions?
John Swinney.
I don't think I can agree with absolutely all of Patrick Harvey's point, but I do agree with the purpose and the sentiment of his argument, which is to ensure that we have in Scotland a network of locally engaged, locally connected banking institutions. Because one of the issues and difficulties that the small business sector is wrestling with in Scotland today is the difficulty of making connections with larger banking institutions that, in not all circumstances, are acting in the best interests of individual SMEs. So that is a point on access to finance that the Scottish Government will continue to pursue and pursue with energy as part of our banking strategy.
Many thanks. And my apologies to those whose questions remain unanswered.